Hello, so this is our group's sheep audit tool presentation. It talks a little bit about both of the tools and their comparisons, and also the sheep industry in general.
For introduction and background, uh, sheep provide commodities such as meat, dairy, and wool. The breeds used mainly for this are Hampshire, Suffolk, Dorper, Dorset, Southdown, and Katahdins. The sectors of the sheep industry in the U.S. consist of seed stock, which is used for breeding purposes, commercial, which is usually meant for meat, dairy, and wool products, and club lamb operations, which is generally used for showing purposes. The economic impact sheep have on the U.S. is huge. Over $2 billion directly contributed to the economy comes from products such as yarn, clothing, and then 500 million of that comes from products not of value added like meat. In California, sheep are the second producer of the country. Uh, the organization creating tools and companies is ensuring the consumers that high animal welfare standards are being utilized within the industry. Consumers are what drive the industry, and consumers decide if the industry will be successful. No consumers pretty much means no business. Consumers have the right to know detailed information about the production systems that they choose to support. Um, Audit tools are subject to continuous improvements. Changes happens as issues with execution, technological advancements arise, and new scientific information is identified. And it's also used to bring people together with the same goals. Some of these goals include supporting and improving animal welfare practices in agriculture. The type of production system utilizing these tools, um, mainly in meat sheep, are stock sheep enterprises, which consist of grazing flocks, which are on pasture or range forage. And they sell to feedlots or are slaughtered to sell. And then feeder lamb enterprises are fed out on pasture until about 60 to 80 pounds, and then they are sold to a feedlot to finish and slaughter. Um, Other types of operations that use this are seed stock, which is breeding for replacement ewes and rams as you either cull or get rid of your other sheep in your flock. Um, Commercial or small or large production systems, organic or non-organic, meat, wool, or dairy systems, or club lamb operations, which is utilized for show and breeding purposes.
So then the target consumers for this industry, so or and the products, so the target products for me is going to be for mutton and lamb, and then wool includes any yarn, any clothing or accessories that are made. And then for the wool retailers, we have the Sudwal Group, Brown Sheep Company, and Endorma Ventures Public Company Limited. And then all these companies are the main retailers, but they also are the main retailers not only in the US but worldwide. So most of these companies also make yarn that is sold like at Michael's, Walmart, or they even make their own products like clothing and accessories that are made to sell. And then for the meat retailers, so the biggest ones that I could find were Whole Foods, Shepherd's Song Farms, and then we just have our supermarkets like Save Mart, Costco, Walmart, anything that really kind of is in the community. They usually have a section for lamb or mutton, but there are many farms that also sell their own. So we have like the Shepherd's Song Farm also is their own production system, and then they also sell the products. And then for the retail price points, so for wool, it really kind of depends on what product you're gonna get, if it's gonna be yarn or product, if it's gonna be sold. So for this wool group, it depends on what product is gonna be made. So It's a different price if they're going to be producing yarn. It's going to be a different price for producing clothes. So it just kind of really depends, and you would have to kind of look into and contact them directly into what product you would want to sell. And then for Brown Sheep Company, it starts from $7.30 and then it goes up to $124.99. And then this company specializes in wool, like yarn wool. So obviously if you want just one little stock of yarn, it's going to be a less expensive and a little bit more affordable rather than buying in bulk of that. And then for it also depends on the product for the Endorma Ventures public company. It goes along with the same because if they are producing yarn, it's going to be a different price than if they're going to be producing clothing or hats or anything like that. And then for the meat products, so for Whole Foods, the price varies by what cuts are available. It really just depends what they get in stock. So they could have like anything from the shoulder to the leg or like the loin or something. It just kind of depends on what they get in and the pricing according to that. But for a more stable market price, like Shepherd Song Farms, they usually run from $17.50, and then a whole carcass would cost you $800.
Okay, for scoring protocol, um, for our audit tool, scoring protocol is going to be a yes or no decision. For example, if standards are not met, then production will not operate until those standards are met. So, basic things like food, water, and shelter not being enough or in adequate condition for the sheep. So, if those are not up to standards, the operation will cease to operate until they fix those matters. For comparison of management aspects, our tools we chose were feed and water and proper living environment. So for feed and water, daily feed rations should be given along with access to well-maintained pasture. So that means the pasture is either irrigated, fenced in, and just well maintained so that the sheep have access to good feed. Proper amount of forages and feed supplements provided. This could be like grains or hay, such as alfalfa, being offered. Feed hygiene is frequently checked. So that means always looking through feed to see if there's any mold or mildew or contaminated by pests such as rats or mice. And then daily checks on water troughs for cleanliness is very important. So you just need to make sure that there is no debris, feces, or algae in the water tank. For living environment, there needs to be provided adequate amount of high quality pasture. As I mentioned, irrigation may be needed to maintain the pasture quality. Ensuring protection of the elements, such as wind, rain, sun, etc. Windbreaks, shade, such as structures and trees, housing, indoor and outdoor structures are needed. The cleanliness of the operation is very important. Clean animal housing that includes bedding if housed indoors. A biosecurity plan should be in place, and there needs to be a suitable environmental enrichment for the sheep, both physical and mental stimulation for proper animal welfare purposes. And then there needs to be proper space requirements. So there needs to be enough space for the amount of sheep that you have. Um, for flooring, it needs to be non-slip and it needs to be sturdy and clean for the sheep. Air quality management. So ventilation, if housed indoors for ammonia, is very important. And pest control plans. Mice, rats, insects, etc., all need to be in check to make sure that they do not contaminate things such as feed, housing, and even spread diseases. The similarities between our two tools are there are unrestricted access to feed and water at all times. The proper cleanliness and hygiene of these practices, feed and water hygiene, housing hygiene, everything needs to be up to a standard of cleanliness. And frequent observations and recording of data throughout the entire operation. So, checking to see if the standards are met and documentation for future references to check anything in your operation that may be changed. As for automatic fails and non-conformance, for feed and water, inadequate water availability, water is withheld from the sheep for more than 2 hours. Water needs to be available at all times. Um, Water needs is not easily or safely accessible by the sheep. So this means if they can't reach the water safely to get a drink. So things such as steps or built up dirt can ensure that the sheep can reach the waterer, including the lambs. Um, but you need to make sure that you eliminate the possibility of them falling into the waterer and not being able to get back out. So things by adding cinder blocks to the bottom of the waterer should be enough for them to get out in case they do fall in. Um, needs to be fresh and clean and at a reasonable temperature. Water should be cleaned and sterilized frequently, and sheep should also have access to graze within the pasture in your operation. So if they do not have access to pasture, then it is an automatic fail. Um, Access to feed is restricted. So any supplemental feed, such as grain, pellets, they need to have access to that to reach the proper nutritional requirements. Poor feed hygiene, as I mentioned before, if it has any mold or mildew or signs that pests have contaminated it, you need to make sure that that feed is the highest quality you can possibly get. The feed does not meet nutritional requirements, so you need to make sure that you're getting a high quality feed that will reach any of their nutritional values that they need to thrive. And then insignificant access to fibrous feedstuffs and supplements. So this includes anything like oat hay, alfalfa, grass hay, and as I mentioned before, any grains or pelleted feed. For the living environment, restricted access to pasture is an automatic fail. They need to have access to pasture as much as possible. They have no access to shade, shelter, or windbreaks. Um, these provide protection of the sheep against the elements in hot and cold weather. Um, Sheep must have continuous, unobstructed access to the outdoor during daylight hours. Um, Inadequate space. So there needs to be a certain uh amount of space, feet squared ratio, depending on how many sheep you have. Each sheep has a certain amount of area that it occupies. So you need to make sure that each of those sheep has that amount of space in order to continue your operation. Slippery or slatted flooring. Slatted flooring shouldn't exceed 25% of the total flooring in the housing. And slippery flooring can cause any injuries, and it's also not very sanitary. Poor air quality, as mentioned before. The ammonia smell in the air needs to be ventilated out. And poor cleanliness. So you need to make sure that your operation is frequently cleaned and sanitized to make sure that there is no any way that there can be an injury or sickness or illness can be spread. No rodent or predator control programs. It's very important to make sure that any pests like rodents are not getting into your operation and messing with feeds and any of that because they do carry diseases. And for predator control programs, it's very important to make sure that you have some sort of program to keep your sheep protected. It can be detrimental to a operation if you have a predator preying on your sheep and you're losing sheep. And an unfit guardian animal. So these can include dogs, llamas, and donkeys. They need to be well trained, capable of deterring predators in the area, and they will not harm the sheep, and they are suitable for farm environmental conditions.
And then auditor instructions. So what auditors are looking for, it really depends on each species, but usually this is the instructions that they are given when looking at and scoring each species. They're going to count the total points from the possible scoring. So in each species there are different sections and criteria. So they're going to count the total points from the possible scoring of all of those. Count the number of not applicable in the scoring. Subtract the number of not applicable from the number of the points available in each of that. And then count the total number of points given. And then divide the total number of points received by the total number of points available. And then as they're doing this, they are making sure that the five freedoms are taken into account. So freedom from hunger and thirst, freedom from discomfort, freedom from injury, pain, or disease, freedom from fear and stress, and then freedom to express natural behaviors of their species. And then, so at the end of the scoring, the auditor must have a discussion with the producer that details why points were either given or why they were lost. Both the auditor and the producer sign that this discussion did take place. If there are any suggestions or changes that should be made to each of what they're going to be scored on or what they were scored on, it is the responsibility of the producer to do that and to also take that into account when they come back and in that corrective action plan. So if the score is less than 100% on in total, a corrective action plan is submitted to the auditor by the producer. And what this plan entails is if they did not score a perfect score on that section of that criteria, they would have to either see what and in that discussion it details, oh, it can be the suggestions or the changes of why they lost that point, and they would have to take into account why they lost that point and try to figure out a way that both makes that score a perfect score and that can better help the sheep in general. So this corrective action plan is submitted to the auditor and it has to be waited for approval of the auditor. So then after the corrective action plan is submitted, a report is done by the auditor. So after that plan is submitted, initially, the auditor is going to either approve it or look over it, and then that report is done and then sent back to the producer, letting them know if it is approved or not approved. But for the time being and during that couple of days, it's going through approval. And then after the approval, the farm is certified, and then auditors can drop in unannounced at any time to perform an audit after this. So it is critical that you stay close to your corrective action plan if it is needed, or you're going through all the guidelines of what you were audited on or what they can audit you on. Because after the certification is done, they don't have to let you know anymore. They can just drop in and perform an audit, and then again, if you don't receive that perfect score, it would be taken away and then you would have to go through the corrective action plan again. And then there are six categories that the producers are scored on for sheep, and they are no crowding, living in an enriched environment, and then enhanced outdoor access. So access is available at all times to the sheep. If they are indoors, they have the access to go outdoors. And then we also have pasture centered. So if they are housed inside, you want to make sure that they have the access to outdoors and that they have the access to a pasture outdoors. So if you have to be Housed, it should be for extreme weather conditions. No physical altercations, so there's no ear tags, castrations, tail docking, anything like that done to the sheep. And then they must spend their entire life on the farm. There is no transportation. Everything must be done there if they're going to see a vet or anything, or they need to have medication or anything like that. It must be on the farm, and you cannot transport it for slaughtering or anything like that. And then, so the scoring on each of these six categories is performed. The auditor is responsible for the most accurate scoring. And then, to make sure that this is ensured, training is done, and the auditor must understand what they are scoring, what they're looking for, what they should be looking at, and what should be done. And then each category can receive anything from a 1 to a 5 plus. So they are marked on these. These categories are what is added up to make the scores, and then non-applicable occurs, but it's based on the species. So each species has a different amount of non-applicables. So then how to pass the audit. So you must have the five freedoms in place. You must have a score of 100% or have completed a corrective action plan. If not, the approval of the plan must happen in order for you to pass an audit. And then if there are any changes at all made to your production or something, or how it is presented, how feed is presented, anything like that, they must be included in the plan, or you must update your plan. And then the farm is not passed until it goes through the approval process. Um, so what happens is that a lot of the times when going through the approval process, most of the productions or producers think that they are approved, but for the most part, you would want to wait it out just in case it does not get approved, so you can go ahead and change that corrective action plan just to fit it and to make to make the production approved. And then for the tools and the improvements, tools can be improved by ensuring that the environment is more adaptable to the sheep. Because if there's anything that changes are made, we want to make sure that these animals are not stressed out. They know where feed and water is at all times. We don't want to limit how they reach feed and water. We want to know they know where it is, how to get it, if it's accessible or not, and just make sure that these tools do not cause them to have fear in their environment or be living stressed out in their environment because of all the changes that are going on. And that was our presentation. Thank you for listening.